So I'm Pete Crow, and this is my long-term friend, Laurence Sparber. We were both officers in Vietnam in two corps in 1967 and 68. I stayed till 69. And what Larry's going to do is talk about his entire tour from the beginning of the time that he left CONUS, Continental United States, until the time that he went back home. So Larry, it's now the summer of 1967. Where are you and what's about to happen here?
Well, I arrived in Saigon in the early fall of '67, and I was being held there in our company group headquarters pending assignment. I had been told that there was a radio project, and with my background in broadcasting, that I would be able to get involved with that. I eventually, after a number of weeks, was sent up to our, at that time, battalion in the Trang, where I stayed for about 3 months, pending the approval of the project so that I could go to the location and get involved in it from the start. From Nha Trang, I ventured up to Pleiku city in the central mountain highlands of the country, where the project was to be put together. Team from the Ryukyu Islands in the Philippines, of several civilians and one lieutenant, were flown over with the equipment to put the project together and get it underway. And that's where my main involvement started. We had a location up in a mountain position about 10 miles from Pleiku City, where we were headquartered at the American installation known as Camp Inari at the time. We constructed the radio station in two parts. The first part was production, which was down at Camp Inari, and I'll speak about that briefly in a moment. And the second part was the physical construction of the broadcast site, consisting of the broadcast equipment, the tower, and several installations that were built by Army personnel that came from the Ryukyu Islands. That included a watchtower of about 25, 30 feet in the air for security, and we also had perimeter security, which was created, and that was manned by indigenous personnel that were allied with the South Vietnamese military. And these people were the known as mountain people. They were the Montagnards. I believe that's a French name for them. And they were very, very efficient at everything they did. They lived with the Vietnamese for a long time, side by side, but never really got involved in the society. It was a separate society, so to speak. And they brought several people in with their families, which was the custom, and they created perimeter trench lines and bunkers, which they manned with equipment that we gave them, some of which was rather antiquated, but nonetheless. And then we had our American contingent up there of about half a dozen men, and they created a traditional type bunker underground with firing arrangements and so forth. And we put the site together. It took about 2.5 months to get it all assembled. I would comment it was very clever. It was air-droppable units, which looked to the average person like a large insulated suitcase type of affair. That was a cube, actually, and these could be dropped from airplanes in any zone and set up for use. They were very efficient, they were state-of-the-art, and they were very compact. I was in charge of the production, which was down, as I mentioned, in Camp Inari, and I had a staff of 4 young Vietnamese women who came in daily, 5 days a week, and they recorded for several hours at a time. This was our psychological operations messages in conjunction with the Vietnamese authorities. And at 5 o'clock every day, They were taken the 10 miles by Jeep. The tapes were taken up to the site because we broadcast starting at 6 p.m. in the evening. And that's when the tapes were used. Some tapes were also used in our airborne efforts using speaker aircraft, and were flown over selected areas. And this all complemented the total PSYOP mission of the time, which included ground forces, which had our teams attached to them, that went into the field and went into villages with the combatant teams, and they would do audio-visual presentations and interview the villagers and so forth, spreading the messages that we wanted those people to be aware of. We also did various airdrop situations, which included leaflet drops, which were also distributed on the ground, and we dropped other things, that food packages and pre-tuned frequency radios that picked up our messages that we broadcast. Those were quite interesting, and novelty things amongst others, such as bars of soap that when you use them, one of our PSYOPs messages would appear in color in the soap. This was an interesting thing. We found out later that it was more effective than even we thought it might be. The idea of our mission statement was simply the PSYOPs ideology of winning the hearts and minds of the population, so that they could see clearly the message that we were behind, and our interest was that they are convinced that we're a better offering than they had been living under at the time, and certainly much better than the northern part of the country, which had been under communist rule for many, many years under the would-be patriot Ho Chi Minh. Of course, at a later time, which I'll get to very briefly toward the end, all this changed and did not turn out to be the way that we anticipated it might. So I continued with that mission for several months, and of course in January of the new year, 1968, the Lunar New Year, which is a major celebration, took place, and simultaneous with it, the Northern Communist hope of toppling the South Vietnamese government. They created a major offensive that took place within 24 hours at all the major points throughout the country. Their premise was that the local South Vietnamese population would come out of their homes and rise up and join them and topple the South Vietnamese government. Well, that didn't happen for a number of reasons that I'm not going to get into here, but just to say that the greater part of the population not only didn't rise up, they didn't want anything to do with what the North had to offer. And later they would suffer the consequences of that in many, many different ways. So they did not succeed in the Tet Offensive, except to wake everybody up to a major extent that they were there and they could come there, and they weren't about to back off. And as far as they were concerned, we needed to go home and leave the country and let them decide where everything would go down the road. And again, I'll allude to that very briefly as I complete my presentation. So shortly after that, I went up to the site one day. I would go up randomly, maybe twice a week. You had to go before 5 o'clock, because after that they mined the road every night. It was mined, and every morning our mine sweeping teams went by and picked up the mine so we could use the road to get up there that day. It's kind of a game that went on day after day. I went up to the site, and around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, a nice bright day, and I was looking over all the progress, and it had come together quite nicely. And while speaking with some of the people there, we looked down at a valley that was below us, and lo and behold, 4 classically dressed Viet Cong guerrillas were having a nice walk down the road past our site. And they were considerably down below us a ways, but they could see us very clearly, and we could certainly see them. It was a situation where if I wanted to or anyone else wanted to, we could have engaged in a gunfight, if you will, and probably there could have been casualties as a result, but we didn't see any reason to do that. They didn't hesitate. They just walked along and they looked, and then they looked straight ahead and they disappeared out of view and they were gone. Well, we knew why they were there. They had been watching our progress for some time. So it would be just a matter of time till we would find out exactly what the result of this final walk by had been. Short time later, at 2 o'clock in the morning, our facility was attacked with a ground attack by Viet Cong guerrillas, and are known as sappers, and those that serve in the country. These are just guerrillas that their primary mission is to take homemade explosives, which were very effective, and destroy everything they could as fast as they could. A number of them were killed, about half a dozen of them. There was probably, I wasn't there at the time, but there were probably about 12 or 15 of them total. About 6 or 7 bodies were collected in the aftermath. So I suspect it was a fairly large group. Unfortunately, some of our Montagnard defenders and 1 or 2 Vietnamese defenders were killed in the action. They succeeded in toppling our tower for broadcasting. They didn't do any damage to the self-contained technical cubes, but they put us out of business, so to speak. And the last part of the tragedy was that the American lieutenant was in charge of the project was mortally wounded. They could not get him down to a hospital, the base hospital in Pleiku, until the dawn hours, because we could not get on the road. And at that time he was, I believe, airlifted down there, but he perished. He did not survive. He died at the hospital. So that was a terrific blow, so to speak. And he became a very good friend, and as well as a very accomplished person to lead his part of the project. And the sadness more so of it, not only losing him, but he left a beautiful wife and 2 young daughters behind in the Ryukyu Islands in the Philippines. We put up, in the next week or so, it was about 5 days, the people up there, the technicians, assembled what we call leading antenna very briefly. It's a wire antenna, and it put us back at about 50% capacity, and we were back on the air. So we never actually went off the air. There had been a station, a very small operation in the down in the Delta region, which had a very limited radius of effect. We had no involvement with that. We were the only major operation of our kind throughout the war, to my knowledge, in Vietnam. So it was a singular kind of an event. We stayed on the air, and we know that we were effective because our ground teams that went out and were attached to combat units would be present when some of the opposition forces would be captured in different engagements. And we also had a good effect from what was called the Hoi Chen process, which meant that soldiers fighting from the other side, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong, could surrender if they had the opportunity and come over to our side. And we had a relative percent of success with that. And of course, we collected a lot of information, intelligence, which was helpful. One of the particular cases I'll just allude to very briefly, which ironically was portrayed somewhat in the television series MASH many years later. A surgeon came over. He was a thoracic surgeon trained in North Vietnam, which, by the way, most people don't know, at one time had one of the finest medical schools in the world for many years. And he sat down and spoke. He spoke English, and he told us that despite all the massive bombing campaigns we had conducted, he could not treat the people he was responsible for in the jungle areas and in the combat areas. They were in caves, sometime underground, where they could be. He said, I had no facilities. I didn't have enough medicine. He said, it was a losing situation. He said, I could not see continuing it. And so he came over voluntarily and joined Southern Side. And there was a fair amount of sentiment for that. It was not overwhelming, but it was more than some people thought would occur. So yes, we did collect good information. The program did work, and it reinforced the idea of psychological warfare school, which I attended prior to coming over. And the idea was always winning the hearts and minds of the people. And as has been proven many times in many places, if the population is not on the side of a cause, it's extremely difficult to have the cause succeed. And our motto was from the PSYOPs major unit was we were called mind benders, the mind benders, and you can use your own imagination as why they chose those words. And so I continued in that vein throughout the spring and the summer of 1968. And at that time, I had a replacement lieutenant arrive, and I briefed him in on the position that he would be taking over, and I got ready to return to the United States. And when I did that, I reflected on what I had accomplished as an individual and what our cause had accomplished and what the whole PSYOP effort had accomplished. And I had a number of conclusions, which is really the important part to me of speaking to you about this now. And despite a lot of people who didn't have much faith in the PSYOP's operations, which always was a low-key component of the military effort, which included, of course, combat on the ground, and it included air campaigns, none of which in the end succeeded in accomplishing our mission, and that's a whole different situation that needs to be addressed in that context. But my conclusion was that I had helped make a difference. We did accomplish good things that we wanted to do that had good results, not in the total effect that we would have liked to see in terms of percentages and numbers, but it definitely, while we were there, made a difference in how things were for both the population and for our military involvement. And I would ask that if you were there, of course, this will make much more relevant sense to you, but if you're just listening to me at this time, perhaps you weren't even born during that period, I would ask that you listen to all the information concerning our time there, why we went there, what the mission was, which I would remind was at the time we got involved actively. Our position was basically to stop the communist movement from moving into the south of the country. It had been divided in two parts for many years. And B, to give the people the option, hopefully towards a democratic system, which was the thrust of why we went there to begin with, for a better life, for a better country, for a better government. Sadly, it didn't end that way, and I'll just touch on that briefly to say I believe everyone that served there, with rare exception, did not see the end occurring the way that it did. It happened rather quickly, and the people just, I believe, many of them wanted a democratic way of life, at least in the broad mainstream, but they were not committed enough for whatever reasons to really join the majority force to make that happen. I met many Vietnamese soldiers who were every bit as good as any soldiers I'd ever seen. They were committed, but there were not enough of them over the broad spectrum of time to have been able to make the difference. Also allied with that was the political and military climate of the time, and that involved two generals that had command, both of which I believe were excellent soldiers, but I would suggest that the political climate in Washington and in Vietnam did not allow them in many occasions to perform in the way that they had in mind to do so. And so we did suffer continually setbacks that probably could have been avoided militarily and possibly even diplomatically, but that's a very complex situation that I'm not going to address here, except to say that in the early 1970s, when President Richard Nixon decided to pull our troops out of Vietnam, that was later. Lyndon Johnson, prior to that, did not rerun for election as president for another term because he had become overwhelmed with the situation. I believe that his perspective was honest and in the right place, as were all our PSYOP efforts. We were honest and true to what we believed to be the proper way to proceed in the situation. Well, when President Nixon pulled the troops out, the bulk of the people in America were glad to see them come home because it was a war, if you will, that was never really accepted very well. The North Vietnamese had pretty much were taking over the country very quickly, and they did so very, very fast. And we no longer could have had a role in the situation, as could not the South Vietnamese population at that point. And that's pretty much how it came down at the end of our commitment. I would remind everyone that this started in 1954 when the French, who had occupied Vietnam for a long time, were routed by Ho Chi Minh and his men in a simplistic but spectacular campaign, which was very quick. And that was that the French had ensconced themselves militarily in a valley. And anyone, even if you're not military, knows that being in a valley is not a very good defensive position. Yeah. And the name of the place was Dien Bien Phu. I'm going to get to that. And so the Vietnamese did what the French didn't believe they could do. They took cannons and all kinds of war machinery, and they went through the jungle. Actually, they walked in the canopy of the jungle, which is very, very substantial. And they got above Dien Bien Phu, and they said to the French, "You need to surrender." And the French looked up and said, "I think we've been had." And they did surrender, and they packed up and went home. And that was the beginning of a lifelong dream of Ho Chi Minh that really started the military aspect of his driving to reunite the country, North and South. And that's the experience I had. People say to me, well, do you think you did the right thing when you went over there? And my answer was, based on the times and the information that I had and the governments had and analyzed, it made more sense for us to go there than not to go there. Now, it's very easy to look back and say, gee, why didn't I see this and why didn't I see that? And of course, that's not very relevant. If now, reviewing everything we did, both as an occupying assisting force at the time by invitation, and the role that I played there in the PSYOP theater of operations, I again believe we did everything pretty much the right way we could at the time. We made mistakes, and on the overall assessment, we suffered for our mistakes, and the end pretty much reflected that. So historically, I would say to you, before you reach any opinions on whether that period of time was a total waste of the time, or maybe a partial waste, or it was a good situation, or it was a great situation, try to think of all the material in the context of what happened over a number of years before you reach your decision about that. And as far as anyone that served there, I would like to think that people at this late date would honor the idea that they were willing to give their expertise and their time to try to make a good idea exist. And that to me is part and parcel to the whole vision of what the Vietnamese experience was for the United States. I appreciate your listening to what I have to say, and I thank the people that are enabling me to say this. And I'm going to sign off as we say in the broadcast world, with the words of the late Walter Cronkite, who was a World War II journalist, reporter, correspondent, and went on to head up the modern CBS news operation for many years as the nightly newscast person, the evening news, 5 nights a week. He was also the managing editor. And when he finished every newscast, he'd look out at the audience, put down his pen, and he'd say, "And that's the way it was. Today, October 25th, 2025.